Most people don't know this, but the F-14 Tomcat's first combat mission wasn't in the 80s or 90s. What if I told you the F-14 Tomcat, the legendary jet from Top Gun, had its first taste of combat in the Vietnam War? Here's the backdrop. The United States began withdrawing troops from Vietnam starting in 1971, signaling the winding down of large-scale military engagement. But the war was still smoldering. The Australian forces, along with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, continued their fight, with the U.S. Air Force providing vital support to the remaining American presence on the ground. By 1973, the conflict had reached a technical ceasefire. The Australians exited, a ceasefire was established, and the U.S. further scaled back its forces in the region. It was an unspoken truth that the South Vietnamese government was on borrowed time. In 1975, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, launched a rapid and decisive spring offensive. The speed at which the NVA captured Saigon caught everyone off guard. Despite extensive evacuations, numerous U.S. personnel, agents, and their allies were left behind, facing grave danger if captured by the advancing northern forces. In March 1975, a massive evacuation effort kicked off, with planes taking off from Tan Son Nhut Airport to rescue over 50,000 people. U.S. C-5 Galaxies and C-141 Starlifters were in constant motion, while Australia and other allied nations joined the effort. The Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, sent a fleet of C-130s to various airstrips, including Phan Rang Air Base, where they managed to rescue 1,500 civilians in a single day, despite being under rocket attack. During the first 2 weeks of April, a coordinated effort by the RAAF, US, and other allied forces saw the airlifting of orphaned children in what became known as Operation Baby Lift. Simultaneously, Marine helicopter crews were dispatched to neighboring Cambodia, which was also in turmoil, to evacuate friendly personnel and civilians in an operation named Eagle Pull. On April 28th, heavy artillery fire began targeting Tan Son Nhut Airport, putting the evacuations in jeopardy. This prompted the implementation of a new contingency plan, Operation Frequent Wind. Instead of relying on increasingly perilous fixed-wing flights, a helicopter force was mobilized to extract as many people as possible before northern forces could seize Saigon. Around this same time, the U.S. Navy began receiving its first F-14A Tomcats. Among the initial operators were fighter squadrons VF-1 and VF-2, both part of Carrier Air Wing 14, stationed aboard the USS Enterprise. Task Force 76 of the U.S. Navy was assigned the primary responsibility for the Saigon evacuation, playing a crucial role in this intense period. However, the evacuation effort required more vessels, prompting the call for additional support from Task Force 77. Ships like the USS Coral Sea and the Enterprise, both equipped with F-14s, were among those mobilized. This deployment marked the Tomcat's first brush with wartime action. In the months leading up to this, F-14 pilots and radar intercept officers had been rigorously training on their new jets, while the Enterprise underwent refitting at port. The modifications included larger, reinforced jet blast deflectors tailored for the Tomcats. These F-14 crews were assigned to combat air patrol over Saigon, a crucial task given the situation on the ground. The North Vietnamese had utilized captured A-37 Dragonflies from Da Nang Air Base to bolster their attack on Tan Son Nhut Airport, creating a potential threat to U.S. helicopters, albeit a slim one. The presence of F-14s provided a necessary deterrent. According to pilots, the Tomcats were armed with 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders and 2 to 4 AIM-7 Sparrows during their patrols. Their duties included escorting slow-flying aircraft and being on standby for air support to protect ground troops if they came under fire. This deployment not only highlighted the Tomcat's capabilities, but also provided a crucial layer of protection during one of the most chaotic periods of the Vietnam War. The specifics of the F-14 deployment during Operation Frequent Wind are still hotly debated. Some accounts suggest that approval was granted for a strafing run against ground targets. Others claim that MiGs were detected and tracked on radar by one of the F-14 flights. There's even a story that hints at a Tomcat sustaining light ground fire damage. However, these tales mainly stem from personal testimonies and lack official confirmation. Footage from this period does show the VF-1 Wolfpack and VF-2 bounty hunters aboard the Enterprise in March 1975. The bulk of the aerial action unfolded on April 29th, the most tumultuous day of the evacuation. The day kicked off with heavy artillery fire on Saigon's outskirts as NVA General Van Tien Dung began his advance into the city, aiming to overpower South Vietnamese General Nguyen Van Ton and his 60,000 ARVN troops. Simultaneously, nearly 190,000 retreating ARVN soldiers were pulling back to Saigon, while Viet Cong forces were reported to be within the city limits. By 6 in the morning, the outlook for South Vietnamese forces was dire. Two South Vietnamese A-1 Sky Raiders patrolling over Tan Son Nhat airfield came under immediate fire, with one being downed by an SA-7 missile. By 7 in the morning, a South Vietnamese AC-119 gunship, which had been operating throughout the night to hold back the NVA, was also shot down. Tan Son Nhat was in utter chaos. During the night, a US C-130 attempting to evacuate refugees had been struck by a 122mm rocket on the runway, while other C-130s sustained heavy machine gun damage. By 10 in the morning, General Homer Smith, stationed at Tan Son Nhat, informed US Ambassador Martin at the embassy that they were enduring relentless artillery and rocket fire, with only one runway still operational. Moments later, this last runway was destroyed when a South Vietnamese fighter pilot, under fire, decided to defect. He jettisoned his tanks and weapons onto the runway, making fixed-wing takeoffs impossible. General Smith relayed this information to Ambassador Martin, who was in communication with Henry Kissinger. Kissinger instructed Martin to personally assess the situation via a Huey helicopter. Half an hour later, Martin confirmed that helicopters would be the sole means of evacuation. At 10:51 a.m., the American radio station began playing White Christmas, the signal for at-risk personnel to proceed to the pre-arranged evacuation points. This marked the start of Operation Frequent Wind. On the flight deck of the Enterprise, planes were launching constantly, knowing anti-aircraft guns and missiles were now within Saigon's range. Yet, both F-14 squadrons flew all day without any enemy engagement. Despite differing pilot accounts, the overall view is that the operation ran smoothly, with the squadron staying airborne for the next 24 hours due to the dire circumstances. By midday on the 30th of April 1975, Task Force 76, along with other friendly Navy vessels, received the final evacuating choppers and started moving away from Vung Tau, signaling the end of the Vietnam War. These F-14s would be back in action the following year, conducting similar combat air patrols over Lebanon in July 1976, where Americans and other foreign nationals were evacuated from Beirut amid civil war. It wasn't until the 1980s that the Tomcat would see its first combat. In late 1980, Iranian F-14s engaged Iraqi planes during the start of the Iran-Iraq War. In 1981, U.S. Navy Tomcats scored their first victories against Libyan aircraft. Considering everything, Operation Frequent Wind was deemed a success. Prior to the final helicopter evacuations, over 50,000 civilians and remaining military personnel had been flown out on fixed-wing aircraft. U.S. helicopters then evacuated over 1,373 Americans and 5,959 Vietnamese. A true all-hands-on-deck effort by U.S. Navy personnel enabled many South Vietnamese Army and Air Force pilots to fly their friends and family onto U.S. ships, abandon their aircraft, and make room for the next wave. South Vietnamese military members also loaded boats with as many people as possible and sailed to meet the American fleet. By the operation's end, more than 138,000 Vietnamese had fled the country and were processed as refugees in America. Operation Baby Lift rescued about 3,300 Vietnamese orphans, flying them to the west where they found new homes. Although the Tomcat didn't engage in combat during Vietnam, this operation heralded a new era of air warfare characterized by faster computers, improved radars, and beyond visual range combat-defining air superiority.